Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Larney. I'm one of your classmates in the public history class at Liberty University. In their work, Introduction to Public History, Interpreting the Past, Engaging Audiences, authors Tristan Lyon, Elizabeth Nix, and Rebecca Shrum write that in 1978, historian Robert Kelly, who founded one of the early graduate programs of public history, that he wrote, "Public history refers to the employment of historians and the historical method outside of academia." They also identify a form of learning as free choice learning, also known as informal learning. It's a term used to identify modes of learning that take place outside a standard classroom setting, such as museums, zoos, and historic sites, as well as film and television. This is the mode of public history learning I will employ in this video presentation about a once noteworthy but now primarily forgotten and demolished fort at the southern mouth of the Hudson River in New York called Fort Lafayette. In 1812, preparations began to build a fort in the water just off the southwest coast of Long Island, an area later known as Brooklyn, as the southern entrance to the Hudson River. This is a stretch of water between Brooklyn and Staten Island referred to as the Narrows. This was to supplement a harbor defense strategy designed by the U.S. Army. The fort would initially be known as Fort Diamond, referring to its diamond-shaped base, and would later be renamed Fort Lafayette to honor the Marquis de Lafayette. Although situated in the Narrows from 1822 until 1960, most current residents of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, have no knowledge of the fort nor of its history, especially as a well-known storage location for numerous prisoners of war during the American Civil War. This presentation will resurrect some of the forgotten local history affiliated with Fort Lafayette. I will provide a general history of the fort and concentrate on its role as a jail for prisoners of war during the Civil War. The fort would house some noteworthy inmates, such as the Baltimore Police Commissioner, members of the Maryland State Legislature, and Robert E. Lee's son, William Henry Fitzhugh. The fort would have several escape attempts. It would be the location of fatal accidents. It would host an execution. It would have a debilitating fire, and eventually the fort would succumb to the wrecking ball of progress. Completed in 1822 at a cost of $318,305.89, the perimeter of the fort would be 215 yards. It covered some 2.5 acres. It consisted of 3 tiers of casemates. It would house 72 cannon. Its staffing would require 500 soldiers during a time of war and 80 soldiers during times of peace. In his 1872 work, New York and its Institutions, 1609 to 1873, The Bright Side of New York, John F. Richmond writes, "Fort Lafayette was commenced on Hendricks Reef, 200 yards from the shore, in what is known as the Narrows, the water doorway to the metropolis." In 1823, during the Marquis de Lafayette's farewell tour of the United States, at the fort, the French and American flags floated from the flagstaff, and it was renamed Fort Lafayette in honor of the distinguished military hero who so nobly championed the Yankees in the First War with Britain. Over the 5 years serving as a prisoner of war detention center during the Civil War, the fort would be referred to by several different names, such as the American Bastille, the United States Hotel, the Brooklyn Bastille, and in the South it was known as the Northern Bastille. On July 29, 1861, the fort received its first prisoner, Mr. E.S. Ruggles of Fredericksburg, Virginia. He went down as a political prisoner, and the fort became a retreat for rebels and a hospital for deceased patriots. It is reported in the September 23rd edition of the Brooklyn Evening Star newspaper that Mr. Ruggles was the first visitor. He was very lonely for 7 days till Dr. Johnson of Baltimore came to keep him company. On the last day of July, no less than 7 persons took up their residence in the fort, and since that time, the daily additions to the company have brought the numbers of residents to 88. The fort was described by one of its guests who spent 2 months there in 1861 as follows. It is built of brick, the walls about 5 feet thick, and has 2 tiers of guns. Besides those, in barbette, looking seaward, the side facing Long Island is merely pierced for musketry. On the ground floor, there are 20 heavy 32-pounders. On the floor above, there was supposed to be the same number, 24-pounders. What there was on the roof was unknown to the prisoners. The yard around which the fort is built contains about 1/4 of an acre. The center was a grass plot used for a parade ground. In immediate command over the Fort Lafayette prisoners was Lieutenant Charles Wood, who was under orders to Colonel Martin Burke at Fort Hamilton. Burke was described as a man apparently 70 years of age, with features as hard as iron. He looked as though he could stand by the rack, thumbscrew, or gibbet, unmoved by the agonies of his victim if ordered. The processing of arriving prisoners would go as follows. Prisoners would be presented to Colonel Burke at Fort Hamilton. Colonel Burke would present a receipt to officers from Fort Hamilton, who would then bring the prisoner, under guard, by boat, to Lieutenant Wood at Fort Lafayette. The prisoner would be received, and another receipt would be presented to the guard from Fort Hamilton, who would then depart. Lieutenant Wood would take whatever money the prisoner had on their person and present the prisoner with the receipt. The person and their belongings would be searched for contraband or weapons, and the prisoner would be escorted into the facility by the sergeant of the guard. In his 1863 work, The Bastilles of the North, Maryland legislature and prisoner Lawrence Sangston provides an account of what it was like to be an early guest at Fort Lafayette. Arriving to the fort on September 26, 1861, he was ferried to the wharf at the fort, where he and some other prisoners were received and required to answer to our names at the wharf stairs by Lieutenant Wood, the commander of the fort, and ushered into one of the battery rooms, already occupied by 24 others. Luckily, I brought my mattress with me, as the government furnishes nothing but an iron bedstead, a pallet of straw, and a shoddy blanket. Sangston fared better than most of the other inmates in that he had made arrangements to have our meals furnished by Mrs. Graves, the wife of one of the sergeants, at 50 cents per meal. Those who have not the means or the inclination to make this arrangement live on the rations furnished by the government, consisting of salt pork, or rather pork fat, hard and soft bread on alternate days, bean soup, and a liquid called coffee sweetened with molasses served on tin plates and cups. A contemporary guest at Fort Lafayette with Mr. Sangston was W.H. Winder. Mr. Winder was arrested and placed in Fort Lafayette at the direction of the U.S. Secretary of State, William H. Seward. Many people found themselves guests at Fort Lafayette at the insistence of Secretary Seward. Of 103 prisoners in Fort Lafayette, New York, on October 14, 1861, 65 had been sent there by the Secretary of State. The telegraph from Mr. Seward regarding Mr. Winder was very simple. It read, "Send W.H. Winder to Fort Lafayette. W.H. Seward." Other prisoners detained at Fort Lafayette provided a more favorable review of the quarters. A September 23, 1861 article published in Baltimore's The Sun newspaper entitled "Life in Fort Lafayette" describes Fort Lafayette not so much as a prison as it is a somewhat exclusive boarding house with significantly stringent rules for the 80 or less boarders in the establishment. Prisoners of means were able to reside in a larger, less crowded casemate. They could pay to have their cooking and washing done for them by the wife of one of the soldiers at the fort. They could receive newspapers and tobacco from outside, and they could get a good breakfast and dinner, with a moderate allowance at dinner of some stimulant. The article even compliments Colonel Burke and his men for their fair treatment. During its time as a prison for suspected and verified secessionists, the fort was subject to several escape attempts, numerous tragic instances, and one execution. One of the first escape attempts occurred just 3 months into the fort's new duty serving as a prison. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 28, 1861, an alert sentry noticed a rope hanging from an open casemate, and a man lowering himself down that rope. The man, a rebel dispatch runner named James Lober, was caught by the sentry, begged hard to be permitted to ascend the rope again into his apartment, and attempted to bribe his captor by the offer of his gold watch and $47.50 in gold coin. Of course, his proposal was not accepted. An unfortunate tragedy occurred on March 12, 1863, when David Shrine, a soldier at Fort Lafayette, was shot and instantly killed by the accidental discharge of a musket in the hands of another soldier named McCarthy. On March 26, 1865, just weeks before the war would come to an end, rebel prisoner Robert Cobb Kennedy, the man arrested for starting a fire at the P.T. Barnum Museum and for being a rebel spy, was hung at Fort Lafayette. This was the only execution conducted at the fort. In March 1866, nearly a year after the end of the Civil War, the last prisoner was released from Fort Lafayette. Unsure how to best use the fort after the Civil War had concluded, the facility generally fell into obsolescence. On December 1, 1868, a disastrous fire, accidentally caused by a carpenter during repairs at the fort, consumed a major portion of the fort. The fort was repaired only to be damaged by fire again to a lesser degree in 1904. In 1893, the Port of New York unsuccessfully petitioned the War Department in Washington, D.C. to allow the fort to be used as an overflow station for well passengers who might be quarantined during a cholera epidemic. Capitalizing on the fort's isolated location, the Army and the Navy used the fort to store munitions during both World Wars. In 1948, a private developer attempted to purchase the island with plans of opening a nightclub at the site. To stop this, New York City developer Robert Moses saw to it that the island was leased to the city in 1948 by the federal government, and the island remained in public hands. The island fort remained under the control of the New York City Parks Department from 1949 until its demolition in 1960. In 1960, Fort Lafayette would disappear from sight and eventually local memory. The fort fell victim to its age and to progress. For years, New York City was looking to build a bridge connecting Brooklyn with Staten Island. Fort Lafayette would play a significant role in achieving this connection. So, in February 1960, heavy cranes began the 2-week task of leveling Fort Lafayette. The Brooklyn side tower of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge now occupies the same footprint where Fort Lafayette once stood guarding the entrance to the Hudson River. Public history has been described as collaborative and engaging. I would like to extend an invitation to everyone watching this video to attempt to discover some of the local history around them, to visit, preferably in person, local museums or historical societies near them. This will help you to discover local history, provide you with an enhanced knowledge and appreciation of the historical significance of your area, and perhaps motivate you to support and engage in historical institutions near you. This may help you identify and resurrect forgotten history in your area, like Fort Lafayette, formerly of Brooklyn, New York. Thank you.